There was a time when they believed you would always be there in the same way, not just physically, but emotionally. They believed your patience had no limit. They believed your heart would always lean toward them, no matter how distant, cold, or confusing their behavior became. You were the one who tried to make sense of the silence. You were the one who gave the benefit of the doubt. You were the one who replayed conversations in your mind, searching for something you might have done wrong. And because you kept showing up, because you kept trying, they quietly built an image of you that felt permanent. To them, you were the safe option, the predictable one, the one who would never truly change. But something shifted, not in a dramatic, explosive way, not in a way that demanded attention or caused a scene. It was quieter than that. It was deeper than that. It started as a small realization, almost like a whisper in your mind, a whisper that said you were tired of feeling confused, tired of trying to earn consistency, tired of feeling like your love had to work overtime just to be acknowledged. And slowly, without them noticing at first, you began to change. You stopped chasing explanations. You stopped filling in the emotional gaps they left behind. You stopped trying to prove your worth through effort and understanding. And the most shocking part was that it didn't feel like a loss. It felt like relief. They didn't see it immediately. At first, it just seemed like you were quieter, less reactive, less emotional. They assumed you were just having a phase. Maybe you were busy. Maybe you were tired. Maybe you were just giving them space. In their mind, nothing had really changed. Because in their world, you had always adapted to their distance. You had always found a way to stay connected even when they pulled away. So why would this time be any different? But this time was different. This time you weren't waiting for them to come back emotionally. You weren't sitting in the background hoping they would suddenly become more open, more present, more available. You were turning your attention inward. You were rediscovering parts of yourself that had been buried under confusion and emotional labor. You were remembering what it felt like to feel calm, centered, and complete without needing constant reassurance from someone else. And that version of you, that was the version they never expected to see. Because the version they knew was the one who stayed soft even when things were uncertain, the one who responded quickly, the one who tried to smooth over tension, the one who offered emotional safety even when they weren't receiving it in return. That version of you made them feel comfortable, not because they didn't care, but because the dynamic felt predictable. They could retreat into their own space and you would still be there. They could go quiet and you would eventually reach out. They could stay emotionally guarded and you would remain emotionally open. It created a silent balance, one where they never had to confront their own fears too deeply, because you were always there to hold the emotional weight. But when you stopped chasing, that balance broke. When you stopped explaining every emotion, when you stopped justifying your needs, something inside them began to stir. It wasn't always obvious, it didn't always look like panic or desperation. Sometimes it looked like subtle curiosity. Sometimes it looked like them checking in more often than usual. Sometimes it looked like silence that carried a different energy, a silence filled with questions they didn't know how to ask, because suddenly you weren't reacting the way you used to, and that difference felt unfamiliar. Avoidant minds are wired to expect emotional predictability. They may fear being overwhelmed by someone else's feelings, but they also grow accustomed to certain emotional patterns. When someone always reaches out, always tries to fix things, always stays available, it becomes part of their internal map of the relationship. It becomes something they rely on, even if they never say it out loud. So when that pattern changes, when the person who once chased now simply observes, it creates a quiet disturbance in their emotional world. Your silence didn't feel like peace to them. It felt like distance. And distance, when it isn't self-chosen, can feel threatening, because they were used to being the one who pulled away first. They were used to controlling the pace of closeness. But now, you weren't chasing them back into connection. You were simply standing still, grounded in your own space, no longer running after something that didn't meet you halfway. And that shift, that calm, steady detachment carried more power than any emotional outburst ever could. They may have told themselves that you were just being strong, or maybe that you were trying to prove a point. But deep down, something felt different. This didn't feel like a temporary mood. It didn't feel like the usual cycle where you would eventually come back with warmth and reassurance. This felt more final, more real, more grounded. It felt like you had stepped into a version of yourself that didn't need the old dynamic to survive. And that realization can be shocking to someone who never expected you to outgrow the role you once played. Because in their mind, you were the constant. You were the emotional anchor. You were the one who would always be there, even when things were confusing or distant. They didn't imagine a version of you who would quietly step back and choose peace over emotional chaos. They didn't imagine a version of you who would stop explaining your feelings and simply live them. They didn't imagine a version of you who would no longer chase clarity from someone who wasn't ready to offer it. Growth, especially quiet growth, can feel like betrayal to an avoidant attachment system. Not because they consciously want to hold you back, but because change disrupts the emotional patterns they rely on. When you grow beyond the dynamic, it forces them to confront something they've been avoiding, the possibility of losing access to the version of you that once felt safe and predictable. And that confrontation isn't comfortable. It brings up questions they don't always know how to answer. It brings up feelings they don't always know how to express. So instead of dramatic reactions, you may notice something subtler. They may watch you more closely. They may check your social presence. They may ask casual questions that seem harmless on the surface, but carry deeper curiosity underneath. They're trying to understand what changed. They're trying to figure out whether this new version of you is temporary or permanent. Because if it's permanent, it means the old dynamic is truly gone. And with it, the sense of emotional control they once had. At the same time, your confidence begins to create a quiet tension in their mind, not because confidence is threatening in itself, but because it challenges the story they had about you. They were used to seeing you as the one who needed reassurance, the one who stayed emotionally invested no matter what. But now you seem centered, you seem calm, you seem unbothered in a way that doesn't feel forced. And that new energy doesn't match the image they had stored in their mind. When someone no longer fits the role you assign them, it creates cognitive dissonance. It forces the brain to update its internal narrative. And for someone with avoidant tendencies, that process can feel uncomfortable because it means acknowledging that the person they once felt emotionally secure with is no longer operating the same way. It means realizing that the safety they once felt in your predictability is no longer guaranteed. Your calm energy becomes the most unsettling part. Not anger, not blame, not emotional outbursts, just calm, steady, self-contained presence. Because emotional volatility is easier for them to navigate. When someone is upset, they know the dynamic. They know how to withdraw, how to create distance, how to protect themselves. But calm detachment removes the script. It removes the predictable cycle of chase and retreat. And without that cycle, they feel a quiet loss of control. There's no emotional fuel to keep the connection running in the old way. No dramatic texts, no late-night confessions, no long explanations, just space. And in that space, they begin to feel something unfamiliar, uncertainty about where they stand with you. Because for the first time, they're not sure if you're still emotionally tethered to them in the same way. They're not sure if you're waiting. They're not sure if you still need them the way you once did. And that uncertainty lingers in the background of their thoughts. It shows up in small moments, when they see you doing well, when they notice you interacting with others, when they realize that your world didn't collapse without them at the center of it. That realization can feel surprisingly heavy because part of them assumed that their absence would leave a noticeable gap in your life. But instead, you adapted, you grew, you became stronger. And now you move through the world with a sense of independence they didn't expect. The version of you that emerged isn't louder or colder. It's clearer. It's more grounded. It doesn't beg for clarity or chase emotional breadcrumbs. It simply exists in a space of self-respect and quiet confidence. And that version of you forces them to confront something they've been avoiding. The possibility that they may have underestimated your ability to grow beyond the dynamic they once controlled. And when someone begins to realize they may have underestimated you, something subtle begins to happen inside them. It's not always loud, it's not always dramatic, but it's real. Because the moment they see that you are no longer revolving around them, no longer structuring your emotional world around their availability, a quiet insecurity starts to surface. The version of you they once understood so clearly now feels unpredictable. And unpredictability, especially when it comes from someone they thought they had figured out, can feel deeply unsettling. Your confidence disrupts the story they had about you. They were comfortable believing that you needed more than they did, comfortable believing that you were the more emotionally invested one, comfortable believing that no matter how distant they became, your attachment would remain stronger. That belief allowed them to stay in control of the emotional pacing. But now your energy feels balanced, equal, steady, and when the balance shifts, so does the power dynamic. You no longer look like someone waiting for reassurance. You look like someone who reassured themselves. You no longer look like someone trying to win affection. You look like someone who knows they are worthy without competing for it. And that quiet self-assurance forces them to confront a version of you they never prepared for. Because when someone becomes secure within themselves, they stop negotiating for basic emotional consistency. They stop overextending to prove they are valuable. They stop shrinking to fit into someone else's comfort zone. And that can feel threatening to someone who relied on your emotional flexibility. Not because they consciously wanted to limit you, but because your flexibility once made things easier for them. Your willingness to understand their space, your patience with their silence, your ability to hold on to hope when things felt distant. All of that allowed them to avoid confronting their own fears too directly. But now your boundaries are clearer. Your silence carries intention. Your space feels chosen, not reactive. And when you become calm in a way that isn't waiting, it removes the emotional tension they were used to. Avoidant dynamics often thrive on imbalance. One person reaches, the other retreats. One person expresses, the other minimizes. One person seeks clarity, the other delays it. That push and pull creates a rhythm, a familiar pattern. But when you step out of that rhythm, when you stop pushing entirely, the dance falls apart. Now they're standing in a space that feels unfamiliar. You're not chasing them back into closeness. You're not reacting to their distance. You're simply existing in your own emotional center. And without your pursuit, they're left alone with their own thoughts, alone with the silence they once controlled. And sometimes that silence starts to echo louder than they expected. They begin to notice things they didn't notice before, the way you don't immediately respond, the way your tone feels steady instead of emotionally charged, the way you seem fulfilled in areas of your life that have nothing to do with them. They might scroll through your presence quietly, observing without interacting. They might send a casual message that seems light on the surface, but underneath carries a deeper question. Are you still emotionally available to me the way you used to be? This is when testing the waters begins. Not always directly, not always openly. Sometimes it's a simple check-in, a random memory brought up, a subtle comment about how things used to be. They're trying to gauge your response, trying to feel out whether the door is still open in the same way. Because even if they never fully committed emotionally before, they grew comfortable knowing that access to you was there. Access is powerful, and when someone senses that access may no longer be guaranteed, it activates something deeper than pride. It activates fear. Not necessarily fear of intimacy, but fear of finality. Fear that the version of you who once tolerated inconsistency may never return. Fear that the safety net they assumed would always exist is now gone. The psychological reversal of power is not about dominance. It's about emotional independence. When you detach without hostility, when you choose peace without theatrics, the dynamic shifts in ways they didn't anticipate. The one who once felt secure in their ability to withdraw now feels unsure about where they stand. The one who once took their time responding now wonders why you aren't reacting. The one who once felt chased now feels the absence of pursuit. And absence can be louder than presence. Because in the past, your reactions reassured them. Even your frustration meant you cared. Even your confusion meant you were invested. But now, you don't react the same way. You don't escalate. You don't plead. You don't demand clarity with urgency. You respond calmly, or sometimes not at all. And that lack of emotional intensity feels unfamiliar. It feels like something is missing. And what's missing is the validation they unconsciously relied on. You were once the mirror reflecting their importance. Your effort showed them they mattered. Your attention reassured them they were desired. Your emotional availability softened their fear of closeness because you carried most of the emotional labor. But when you stop reflecting that energy back in the same way, they feel a subtle drop in their sense of significance. It's not that they don't have value, it's that they were used to receiving a certain type of affirmation from you. And when that affirmation fades, they have to sit with themselves more fully. They have to question whether they contributed enough, whether they showed up enough, whether they misjudged your capacity to grow. This is when replay begins. Conversations echo in their mind. Moments they brushed off now feel heavier. Things you once said gently now carry new meaning. They might remember the times you expressed your needs calmly and realize how easily those needs were minimized. They might recall the patience you showed and wonder why they assumed it would last forever. Reflection is uncomfortable for someone who avoids emotional depth, but your transformation forces it, not through confrontation, but through contrast. The contrast between who you were and who you are now highlights what changed. And what changed is not just your behavior, it's your self-perception. You no longer see yourself as someone who must work to be chosen. You see yourself as someone who is inherently worthy of consistent effort. That shift in self-perception radiates outward. It shows in the way you speak, in the way you hold boundaries, in the way you don't over-explain your absence. And when someone realizes they can no longer rely on your overextension, it shakes their sense of emotional control. There is also something else they begin to feel, though they may never say it aloud: a subtle regret. Not necessarily loud enough to prompt dramatic declarations, but quiet enough to linger. Regret that they may have taken your softness for granted. Regret that they assumed you would always adapt. Regret that they didn't fully appreciate the version of you who tried so hard to understand them. Because now that version feels distant, not hostile, not bitter, just evolved. And evolution can feel like loss to someone who stayed the same. They might appear unaffected on the outside. They might maintain composure. They might act as though everything is normal, but inside there is movement. Inside there are questions. Inside there is a recognition that something important shifted. And that shift wasn't triggered by conflict. It was triggered by your clarity. You didn't explode. You didn't accuse. You simply stopped participating in a dynamic that drained you. And that kind of quiet strength is harder to dismiss because it doesn't leave room for blame. It doesn't give them a villain to point at. It simply exists as a fact. You grew. And growth can be intimidating to someone who isn't ready to confront their own patterns. As you continue stepping into this new version of yourself, you may notice moments of emotional pull, moments where they reach out unexpectedly, moments where they seem warmer than usual, moments where they test whether the old connection can be revived in the same way. And it's important to understand that this isn't always manipulation. Sometimes it's confusion. Sometimes it's genuine realization. Sometimes it's their attachment system responding to the sudden absence of emotional certainty. But what matters most is this: you are no longer operating from fear of losing them. You are operating from understanding yourself. And that internal shift changes everything. Because when you no longer fear their distance loses power. When you no longer chase clarity, their silence loses control. When you no longer measure your worth by their availability, their inconsistency loses its grip. And in that space, something powerful happens. You begin to see them clearly, without the emotional haze that once clouded your judgment. You see the patterns, you see the avoidance, you see the ways you once overcompensated, and instead of feeling angry, you feel aware. Awareness is different from resentment. Awareness is grounded. It allows you to choose differently without needing to prove anything. And perhaps the most shocking part for them is this: you are not trying to hurt them back. You are not playing games. You are not seeking revenge. You are simply no longer accepting half-love. You are no longer shrinking to maintain access. You are no longer negotiating your needs for the sake of potential. You are whole on your own. And when someone who once relied on your emotional pursuit realizes that you are whole without them, it forces a confrontation they never anticipated. They must either rise to meet the new version of you with equal emotional presence, or accept that the dynamic they once depended on no longer exists. That is the shock. Not that you changed, but that you changed without needing their permission. Not that you became distant, but that you became secure. Not that you stopped caring, but that you started caring about yourself more. And that realization lingers in their mind long after the silence settles. And when the silence settles, when the dust of the old dynamic finally clears, something even deeper begins to unfold. Because now the focus is no longer just on how they feel about your transformation, it becomes about how you feel within it. This is the part no one talks about. The quiet nights when you question whether you did the right thing, the moments when your strength feels heavy instead of empowering, the times when you miss the version of them that only showed up in glimpses. Because growth does not erase attachment overnight, it simply changes how you carry it. There may still be moments when your heart pulls backward, when you remember the warmth in their voice during rare, vulnerable conversations, when you think about the way they looked at you during the times they briefly let their guard down. Avoidant connections are often built on intensity mixed with distance, which makes the highs feel intoxicating. And walking away from that intensity, even for your own peace, can feel like withdrawal. So if you've felt that ache, that quiet longing for what could have been, it doesn't mean you're weak, it means you love deeply. But here's what changed. You no longer allow longing to override clarity. You no longer romanticize potential over reality. You no longer ignore patterns because you're afraid of losing connection. That is the real transformation. You are no longer abandoning yourself to maintain emotional access to someone else. And even though that decision hurts sometimes, it also builds something inside you that cannot be shaken so easily again. Meanwhile, something continues happening beneath their composed exterior. Because when someone who is used to emotional control loses it, they don't always react loudly. They internalize, they analyze, they observe from a distance. They may never admit how much your absence unsettles them, but they feel the difference, especially when they realize that you are no longer responding to breadcrumbs. In the past, small gestures from them may have been enough to reignite your hope. A late night message, a hint of vulnerability, a brief surge of affection. And you would open the door again, carefully but willingly. But now you measure consistency, not moments. You look for patterns, not promises. And that forces them into unfamiliar territory, because for the first time, the effort required to maintain access to you has increased. And this is where emotional reversal deepens. The one who once pulled away easily now finds themselves thinking about you more often than they expected, not necessarily because they are suddenly fully ready for intimacy, but because your detachment created space for reflection. When you stopped chasing, their mind had room to wander. And often it wanders back to you, back to the stability you offered, back to the understanding you gave, back to the emotional safety you provided, without demanding perfection. They may begin to compare new interactions to what they had with you, and comparison can be uncomfortable. Because what you gave was genuine, you weren't playing games, you weren't withholding affection as leverage, you were simply trying to build something real. And when they encounter connections that feel transactional or shallow, they may start to recognize what they lost in your grounded presence. But here's the truth that matters most. You are no longer waiting for their realization to validate your growth. You are building a life that does not revolve around whether they finally understand. You are pouring energy into yourself, your goals, your healing, your friendships, your passions, and the more fulfilled you become independently, the less space remains for confusion. That doesn't mean you've erased history. It means history no longer dictates your worth. There's something incredibly powerful about becoming the person who feels safe alone, because in the old dynamic, their independence may have intimidated you. Their ability to detach may have made you feel small. You may have wondered why you couldn't turn off your emotions as easily. But now you understand something deeper. Emotional availability is not weakness. It is strength. And choosing to be alone rather than half loved is not rejection, it is self respect. When you become comfortable in your own company, you no longer chase validation from someone who struggles to give it. And that emotional self sufficiency equalizes the dynamic in ways that surprise them. Because now they are not the only one who can walk away and be okay. You can too. And that realization unsettles any lingering sense of control they once held. There is also something else happening that they may never admit. They begin to feel the weight of uncertainty. Before, they assumed you would always be emotionally accessible. They assumed that no matter how much time passed, you would respond, that the door would remain cracked open. But now the door feels heavier, not slammed shut, just guarded. And when access is no longer guaranteed, value increases. It's human nature to take stability for granted, especially when it has always been there. You were stable, you were consistent, you were emotionally present, and because you were always there, they didn't fully feel the risk of losing you. But now that you've stepped back, that risk feels real. And real risk creates anxiety. You may notice it in subtle changes. They may linger in conversations longer than usual. They may attempt deeper discussions they once avoided. They may ask questions about your life that signal curiosity about where you stand. This is not always a conscious strategy. Sometimes it is simply their attachment system waking up to the possibility that you are no longer emotionally tethered. But here's where your growth is tested. Because when they lean in slightly, it can be tempting to soften completely. It can be tempting to believe that this shift means everything has changed, and maybe it has, or maybe it hasn't. The difference now is that you don't rush to decide. You observe, you feel, you assess consistency over time, instead of clinging to a single emotional moment. That patience with yourself is new, and it is powerful. You are no longer reacting from fear of abandonment. You are responding from awareness. You are no longer trying to decode every mixed signal. You are watching actions align with words. And if they don't align, you no longer twist yourself into confusion to make it make sense. At the same time, they may be battling something internally that you cannot see. Because avoidant patterns often mask vulnerability. They may feel regret and not know how to express it. They may feel longing and suppress it out of pride. They may want to reach for you and hesitate because vulnerability feels unsafe. So externally, they may still appear calm, even indifferent. But internally, the narrative has shifted. You are no longer the guaranteed emotional constant. You are the person who chose self-respect, and that choice changes how they see you. You are no longer just the one who cared more. You are the one who walked away with dignity, the one who didn't beg for clarity, the one who didn't chase empty promises, the one who quietly leveled up instead of loudly breaking down. And there is something deeply magnetic about that kind of strength, because it signals that your love was never about dependency. It was about sincerity. And when sincerity meets self-respect, it becomes unshakable. If you are watching this and you feel the ache of this transformation, know this: the discomfort you felt when you stepped back was not failure. It was growth stretching you beyond what was familiar. You were used to fighting for connection. You were used to proving your value through persistence. Letting go of that instinct required courage. It required you to sit with loneliness instead of chasing relief. It required you to trust that if someone truly wanted to meet you halfway, they would. And even now, as you continue forward, there may be moments of doubt, moments when you wonder whether you should have tried harder, whether you gave up too soon, whether they might change if you just waited a little longer. But remember this: love does not require you to abandon yourself repeatedly to sustain it. You did not change to punish them. You changed to protect yourself. And whether they fully understand that or not is no longer your responsibility. The most powerful shift in this entire story is not their shock. It is your stability. It is your ability to hold your heart gently without handing it to someone who isn't ready to hold it back. It is your decision to stop chasing emotional availability from someone who struggles to offer it consistently. And as you continue evolving, something beautiful happens. You begin attracting different energy, people who appreciate clarity, people who respond with presence, people who don't make you question where you stand. And when you experience that kind of connection, it reinforces what you learned the hard way. You were never asking for too much, you were simply asking the wrong person. Meanwhile, they are left with a memory of who you were and a realization of who you've become. And sometimes that contrast lingers longer than they expect, because you didn't just walk away emotionally, you transformed. And that transformation, whether they admit it or not, will always remind them of the version of you they underestimated. And as time continues to move forward, the emotional distance between who you were and who you have become becomes even clearer, not just to them, but to you. Because at some point, the confusion that once filled your mind begins to fade. The overthinking slows down. The constant urge to interpret their silence loses its intensity. And in that quiet space, you begin to hear your own voice again. For a long time, your emotional world may have revolved around their reactions. Their messages could lift your mood, their distance could sink it, their small gestures of affection could feel like oxygen, their coldness could feel like suffocation. You were emotionally tethered to someone who was never fully present, and that tether kept your nervous system in a constant state of anticipation. But now, the emotional center of gravity has shifted back to you. And that shift is something they may never fully understand because they never experienced the internal battle you fought to reach this point. They never saw the nights you questioned your worth. They never felt the exhaustion of constantly trying to read between the lines. They never carried the weight of loving someone who only opened up in fragments. So when they see you now, calm and grounded, it may look effortless from the outside. But what they don't see is the emotional work behind that calm. They don't see the boundaries you had to build, the realizations you had to accept, the attachments you had to loosen, even when it hurt. They don't see the courage it took to choose peace over potential. And because they didn't witness that transformation from the inside, it can be difficult for them to grasp how real it is. That's why, even when they're shaken, they may still appear cold, still composed, still distant. Avoidant patterns are built around emotional suppression. When feelings become overwhelming, the instinct is to retreat inward, to minimize, to rationalize, to detach. So instead of openly expressing the impact of your transformation, they may act as though nothing has changed. They may keep conversations surface level. They may avoid emotional depth. They may convince themselves that your shift is temporary, that eventually you'll return to the familiar dynamic. But deep down, something has already changed because they have felt the difference. They have noticed the absence of your emotional pursuit. They have seen the calm in your responses. They have sensed the space you now hold around your heart, and even if they never admit it out loud, that difference lingers in their thoughts. There may be moments when they feel an unexpected wave of regret. Not the dramatic kind, not the kind that leads to grand apologies or confessions, but the quiet kind, the kind that shows up when they remember the way you used to look at them, the way you listened, the way you tried, the way you believed in the connection, even when things felt uncertain. They may realize that the version of you who offered that depth is no longer available in the same way, and that realization can feel heavy because they never expected you to stop trying. They assumed time would keep you emotionally accessible. They assumed your patience was permanent. But patience without reciprocity eventually becomes self-abandonment, and at some point, you chose yourself. You didn't become colder, you became clearer, you didn't become distant, you became grounded, you didn't stop caring, you stopped chasing, and that difference is everything. Because when someone stops chasing, the illusion of control disappears. The old dynamic depended on your emotional pursuit. It depended on your willingness to keep reaching, keep explaining, keep hoping. But now, there is no pursuit, there is just presence. Quiet, steady, self-respecting presence. And that kind of energy cannot be manipulated. It cannot be pulled into the same cycles. It simply exists independent of someone else's emotional availability. At first, they may try to interact with you in the old way, casual messages, light conversations, familiar patterns, but over time, they begin to notice that something is different. You are kind, but not overly accommodating. You are warm, but not emotionally overextended. You are present, but not waiting. And that shift forces them to confront a reality they once avoided. You are no longer available for half love. You are no longer willing to build a connection alone. You are no longer willing to fill in the emotional gaps by yourself. You are no longer willing to interpret silence as affection. You are no longer willing to accept inconsistency as depth. And this realization can be shocking because it challenges the role they once believed you would always play. You were the one who stayed, the one who understood, the one who forgave, the one who waited. But now you are the one who walks with dignity, the one who chooses clarity, the one who honors their own emotional needs, the one who refuses to shrink for the sake of access. And that transformation becomes a mirror they cannot ignore. Because your growth highlights the areas where they remained the same. Your emotional maturity reflects their emotional avoidance. Your clarity exposes their confusion. Your boundaries reveal the absence of their own. And mirrors can be uncomfortable, especially when they reflect something we are not ready to face. They may begin to notice patterns in their life that once felt normal, the way they pull away when things get close, the way they minimize emotions, the way they keep people at a safe distance. And for the first time, they may start to wonder whether those patterns cost them something real. Because you were real. Your love was real. Your effort was real. Your patience was real. Your presence was real. And when something real leaves, even quietly, it creates a space that is difficult to replace. But the most important part of this story is not their realization, it is yours. Because at some point, you stopped measuring your worth by whether they chose you. You stopped asking yourself what you needed to do to keep them interested. You stopped trying to decode their silence. You stopped bending your emotional needs into smaller shapes just to fit into their comfort zone. You chose something different. You chose self respect over emotional confusion. You chose clarity over mixed signals. You chose peace over potential. You chose yourself. And that choice, even if it felt lonely at first, becomes the foundation of a stronger emotional life. Because once you stop accepting half love, you create space for something whole. Once you stop chasing inconsistency, you become more receptive to stability. Once you stop abandoning yourself, you start attracting people who don't ask you to. And whether they ever fully understand your transformation or not, it doesn't change the truth. You didn't evolve to shock them, you evolved to save yourself. You didn't step back to punish them, you stepped back to protect your heart. You didn't grow to prove a point. You grew because staying the same was hurting you. So if they are shocked by the version of you that emerged, it is not because you became someone unrecognizable. It is because they never expected you to become someone who no longer revolved around them. And that is the final shift. You are no longer available for confusion. You are no longer available for inconsistency. You are no longer available for emotional crumbs. You are available for peace. You are available for clarity. You are available for love that meets you fully. And whether they step into that space or not is no longer the question that defines your life, because the version of you that emerged does not wait to be chosen. They choose themselves.